So we're going to review the macaron, this little Parisian patisserie item. So the shell itself wants to be a little foot on the bottom. That's that little bit that it's risen up from. Nice and smooth on the top, no grease. It shouldn't be grainy and it shouldn't have little oil slicks on there. So this is a really good example actually. The colour of these is completely up to you. And also the filling. We've got jelly in here today, but you can put buttercream if you prefer. It's very important to have these cooked correctly. So if you overcook them, it's hard to tell if you've overcooked them, but they normally take 10 minutes. Let it cool down slightly on the tray and then it should just lift away. If they stick, they're undercooked. But it's hard to tell in the first instance whether they're cooked or not. And more often than not, people will leave them in the oven and then they become very, very brittle and chewy. So the taste of these should be, yes, they've got a shell on the top, a sort of crust on the top, but actually inside they should be soft, okay? And it is really soft. Lovely to eat. The jelly is actually really refreshing in this. In my opinion, much nicer than a buttercream. Very tasty. So we're making macarons, which is the refined Parisian version of what the monks would have made, which would have been a very crude, sort of desiccated coconut, almost sort of dollop it on a tray. This is a very refined, non-grainy version, so a modern patisserie version. And the first thing we've done is preheat the oven 150, so it's a low temperature. And rather than using a silicone mold, I find you get a better result, a better shape, just by creating your own template. It's on a piece of paper, which you can slip underneath your parchment paper as a guide. So the traditional size of these is 30 millimeters. So that's all ready. We've got 2 trays lined. The next thing to do is to make an almond sugar powder by blending them together. We're also going to make a yellow version of this. So we're going to add a fairly decent amount of powdered colouring. So this is the professional grade colouring. Rather than a gel or a fluid, we're using a powder. You can get this online. And we're going to very carefully place the almonds and the sugar into our processor. So there's lots of other nuts that you can make this with. Works really nicely with hazelnuts, pistachio nuts. So it's not strictly crucial that you have to blend this together. And in fact, if you blend it too much, what you end up with is a macaron shell, which is very greasy on the top. So we're just looking to blend it before sieving it, just briefly. So this is a really popular recipe from a restaurant perspective, often served as part of a dessert or potentially as a petit four, with coffee at the end of the meal. On a dessert basis, you don't have to do them quite so small. You can do slightly larger ones. But it's also a very popular baking activity as well. So we've distributed the powdered colouring really nicely. And what you find with the powdered colouring is that the colour gets more prominent when you cook it, so when it's introduced to heat. So this is the almond and sugar powder. So there's a number of things that can go wrong with macarons, and it's not always easy to find a good recipe for this. So the things that can go wrong is they can be chewy or overcooked, they can be too raised and not level or shiny, or they can be greasy. So we'll look at how to mitigate that as we go through. So there's our preparation of the almond sugar. The next thing to do is to make a meringue with caster sugar and the addition of salt. Okay, always a little bit of salt in there. And for this particular recipe, we're going to add the sugar right at the beginning. We're looking for stiff peaks, so really quite firm and dry. So we want to make sure this is stiff. Lift the whisk directly up and you can see there you've got a nice stiff peak. You can take it just slightly further, but you don't want it too dry, so just slightly more. Okay, so lift it straight up and over, and it's nice and stiff. So this is often the first mistake, if you haven't made these before, is not having it stiff enough. So what happens when you add the rest of the ingredients is that it gets looser and looser, and although a loose mixture will make you a lovely shiny macaron, it won't hold and rise up. So if you make these correctly, they'll have a little foot around the bottom where it just rises up. It's called a pied at the bottom. So the next thing is to incorporate the almond sugar, and we'll do this in 2 batches. So you can be fairly brutal with this. There's definitely a time situation with this as well. So this won't sit around for very long. You need to move fairly quickly with this. Get it into the piping bag and pipe it, because it will start to loosen off. Now the consistency here, before you put it into the bag, is also important. It needs to be just finding its own level, but not too fluid. When you pipe this through a small plain nozzle, it will continue to work the mixture, so you have to compensate for that. So the other thing we're going to add to this is some almond extract, and we've just got it measured in a pipette here. So this just enhances the flavour. Just a little bit there. It's very strong. So let's have a look and see whether it's finding its own level. Just let the mixture subside. So sometimes people complain about a very gritty surface to the macaron, and that's mitigated by blending and making the almond sugar. Other macarons are very sort of lumpy and bumpy, and that's because the consistency here isn't correct, it's too thick. Now this is just about finding its own level, and by the time it's gone through here, it will be perfect. So it's just very slowly finding its level. You want to move fairly quickly with this now, and just use a jug to facilitate. Just turn the end up, pop the bag in, and then pour it straight in. Now the test of a good mixture is that it will just start to flow out of the bag as you pick it up. Just arrange your template. So it should just start to flow out naturally. Okay, so that's a good consistency. So get yourself ready, and then straight down. Just allow it to flow out of the bag. Just reach the edge of the template, and then a sharp swirl to finish off. So stop piping and swirl it around. So the alternative to the swirl is actually to come directly up. So the alternative here is to pipe, stop piping, and just come straight up. So fill your tray, and then these go into the oven for no more than 10 minutes. Check them at 8 minutes at 150. The sign of a good shell is when it's crusted, but it's also, you're able to release it from the paper, but inside it's lovely and soft and marshmallowy. If you overcook these, they're very brittle and no good at all. Okay, so 8 to 10 minutes, depending on the efficiency of the oven. So we're going to make a fruit jelly, and the first thing to do, in fact, is to soak your gelatine. Okay, so leaf gelatine in cold water, straight in. Only takes a few minutes, must be cold water. Then you'll need a stock syrup. So a stock syrup has lots of different applications, whether it be cocktails or part of a mousse or a jelly in this instance. A stock syrup is equal quantities of sugar and water, boiled together so it combines completely. So we need it warm in this instance, so to warm it through, and then we're going to add the fruit puree. So this can be any fruit puree that you want. So we've got a blueberry jelly here, we've got a mango jelly. In this instance, we're using raspberry. And the best way to make your puree is really with frozen fruit. So straight into a pan, warm it through, sieve it, and puree it. You might find you need to add a little bit of extra water just to get the consistency right. And you can also add icing sugar as well, if you prefer it sweeter. If it's not frozen fruit, extremely ripe fruit is preferable. So combine the puree with the stock syrup. And so this has come to the boil, but it's then been taken off the heat. So it's nice and warm. You can wring out the gelatine and add that directly to the pan. So it's really straightforward. One thing you want to be careful of here is not to aerate the mixture too much, so don't stir it too much. You want to discourage adding bubbles to this. Keep it nice, the movement nice and slow. And then, as a precaution, because sometimes, occasionally, if your pan isn't hot enough, you can get a little bit of some lumps of gelatin. So as a precaution, just sieve this. and then allow the jelly to cool down and stir it occasionally. What you'll find with gelatine is if you stir it all the time, it just prevents it from setting. You also increase the chance of aerating the mixture, which you don't want to do. But just stick it into a large bowl. If you're in a rush, you can put some ice underneath and just allow it to begin to set. It will tend to set around the edge, first of all. And that's the point where you can just stir it a little bit, just to encourage the mixture to be of an even temperature. As soon as it's cold, you can use this. So you can flood your cheesecake, or you can tip it into a container ready to stamp out some shapes. So that's fruit jelly.